Palestine.
And that was the address of the Iraqi President Saddam Hussein. As you can see, no Hollywood set for the Iraqi president. He seems to be reading from his own notes on a notebook as he addressed the people. Perhaps he, like some of the commanders, were surprised when this attack took place at first light in Baghdad. The American president, of course, using a teleprompter to speak directly to his people and the rest of the world. You're watching our special coverage of the American-led attack against Iraq. The US-led operation against Iraq begins. Explosions are heard over the Iraqi capital, Baghdad. Shortly after the attacks begin, the American president goes live on television to say this is the start of a broad and concerted campaign.
On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign.
God's willing, victory will be on your side. Your enemies will go to hell and will be shamed.
And this is the scene in Baghdad now. Calm has returned to the capital. Welcome to BBC World News. I'm Lise Doucette in the Jordanian capital, Amman. The first strikes against the Iraqi capital, Baghdad, began about 90 minutes after the deadline expired for Saddam Hussein and his sons to leave Iraq or face an invasion. The United States used stealth bombers and cruise missiles, Tomahawk cruise missiles, to target what were called targets of opportunity on the outskirts of Baghdad. Anti-aircraft fire reverberated across the city and explosions were seen in the capital, Baghdad. Shortly after the attacks began, the American President George W. Bush went live on American television, saying that this would be the start, the opening stages of a broad and concerted campaign. First strikes in Operation Shock and Awe used Tomahawk cruise missiles and precision-guided bombs against a site where senior Iraqi leaders were thought to be. A short while later, Iraqi state television broadcast an address by Saddam Hussein in which he spoke defiantly of victory for the Iraqi people. Earlier, American and British planes attacked Iraqi long-range artillery and military command sites in the southern no-fly zone. They were too close to coalition forces in Kuwait. And in Baghdad overnight, the streets of the Iraqi capital had been almost deserted. People either fled the city, stayed in their homes, or packed the air raid shelters. Robert Parsons now reports.
As dawn breaks on Baghdad, the airstrikes begin. Anti-aircraft fire could be heard all over the city as Baghdad's defences fought back. The Pentagon says cruise missiles have been launched against targets of opportunity, including what it's calling a decapitation attack against members of the Iraqi leadership. Speaking live to the American people, President Bush made what amounts to a declaration of war.
American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign.
British and American fighter planes were on alert throughout the night, but several hours after President Bush's deadline to Saddam Hussein expired, the main assault was still on hold. At the Kuwaiti border with Iraq, the ground forces are straining at the leash, the tension now almost palpable. Huge numbers of US and British troops have moved into the demilitarized zone, ready to launch a twin-pronged attack towards Baghdad and the port city of Basra. During the night, demonstrators in Baghdad protested against the war. But ordinary Iraqis are bunkering down, hoping that the storm will pass them by. The streets are deserted, the shops closed. The people of Iraq are waiting in trepidation. Robert Parsons, BBC News.
And when Saddam Hussein addressed his people a few hours after the attacks began, he told them to prepare themselves to defend themselves against an attack by the insane Bush, as he called the American president. He called on them to use their sword against the enemy and said the Iraqi people would prevail. Certainly an attempt by the Iraqi leader to give confidence to his people that in the end they would win out. Well, let's just see how the speech has gone down in Iraq, and in particular in the Kurdish-controlled areas of northern Iraq. We can join my colleague John Simpson, who's there. John, any reaction among the Kurds to what Saddam Hussein had to say?
Well, fascination, I think, probably is the word. It was an extraordinary performance by Saddam. I think we can forget, frankly, the many thoughts that it might have been his double who was speaking to us. Saddam himself makes all those speeches. I don't think there's ever been a case where one of his doubles has spoken publicly like that. And it was obvious that he had jotted down his ideas on a notebook. He was reading those ideas out, rambling, deeply repetitious, quite reminiscent, in fact, of how he was in 1991 when he was under such huge strain then, and seemed like another one of those attempts of his to put himself on the same basis as President Bush, to say the things about President Bush, only more so that President Bush was saying.
Including 2 ministries. Iraqi television has reported that the home of the family of the Iraqi president was targeted. The report said no one was injured in the attack on the house where Saddam Hussein's wife and daughters live. Further south, a huge column of United States armored vehicles, including tanks, is said to be advancing through northern Kuwait. A BBC correspondent travelling with the troops says he's witnessed a display of awesome power as the American forces launched a sustained bombardment of southern Iraq. We've also heard from the White House today. We've also heard from the Pentagon today. But the column we're speaking of is part of a large American 3rd Infantry Division, which consists of 10,000 vehicles. Our correspondent says their destination is unknown. The move follows a heavy aerial bombardment of southern Iraq by US planes and missiles. We can go to pictures now. Those are the pictures I think we are receiving from the USS Constellation. We have heard today that the Turkish parliament, and this is quite significant, has allowed American planes to overfly Turkish airspace, though it hasn't actually budged on the question of whether American troops should be able to land in Iraq, in Turkey. It has, though, said, and this may be of some concern to the Kurds in northern Iraq, that Turkish troops will be allowed to enter into northern Iraq. Troubling for the Kurds, of course, because the Kurds may fear the actions of those Turkish soldiers when they come into the Kurdish-controlled areas. And now, just in a few moments, we'll be able to go over to join Nick Gowing in Doha.
Forces are being commanded by General Tommy Franks and Air Marshal Brian Burridge for the United Kingdom, as well as the Australian forces. Within the last few minutes, we know that units of the US Marines Expeditionary Force have now moved into southern Iraq. We also know that during the day, US forces fired howitzers on southern Iraq against Iraqi forces in order to prepare the ground for any move forward on the ground by British and American ground forces. In Baghdad, we await to hear more details of what has been happening within the last hour with more cruise missile attacks on very specific targets. But before those targets were hit and before nightfall, Raghi Omar was able to send this report. It was monitored by Iraqi authorities.
It began just before dawn. After months of threats, the moment of war was heralded by the chilling sound of air raid sirens. Almost immediately, Iraqi anti-aircraft positions began firing repeated barrages, their tracer rounds arcing into the sky. The sound of the Iraqi guns reverberating around the city were broken by the deep explosions of incoming missiles and bombs. The explosions we could see and hear were in the outskirts of the city. The Iraqi authorities say a television facility and a customs house were hit and one civilian died. But this was not the unrelenting bombardment that everyone was anticipating. And by first light, it had all subsided. This is the man who was the target of the attacks. By early morning, the Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein appeared on state television, nothing if not defiant.
There may be defiance by the Iraqi leadership, even relief that the unrelenting bombardments that they were expecting didn't materialize on the first night of this war. But for ordinary Iraqis, it's a very different picture. They know that they will bear the brunt of what will follow.
Iraqi officials took journalists to one of the main hospitals in Baghdad. Its treatment rooms trying to help people the authorities said had been injured in the bombing. In the midst of the war, there is too a battle over international opinion, and the plight of Iraq's civilians will increasingly become central to how the war will be judged, and the Iraqis know this. Save for a few positions dotted around the capital, the huge forces that may have to defend these streets are not on show. The lessons from the first Gulf War have been learned. Raghi Omar, BBC News, Baghdad.
Well, at the moment, we're getting almost no information from the American-led forces of what is happening militarily yet. It's one of the paradoxes. We're seeing more live pictures from more parts of any operation we've ever seen. Live now to the US Constellation, one of the 5 task force and battle carrier groups which is out there somewhere in the seas behind me in the Gulf. These live pictures, we have seen planes taking off in the last few minutes, indicative of an intensity of air operation.